And, you know, otherwise my whole career has been revolved around photography. I worked for 8 years as a technical support rep with Nikon Inc. I was one of those guys at the end of the 1-800 line who would answer questions about the equipment. And then I did 8 years as an associate editor with Outdoor Photographer magazine and and also was it a PC photo magazine. And then after that, I just ventured off and just worked as a freelance photographer and writer. I've written about 5 or 6 books, 5 books, 5 or 6 books on the subject of photography. And I do a podcast, which I've been doing for the last 15 years, which is called The Candid Frame, in which I interview photographers about their work and their career. And I think I have over 550 interviews that I've done with all kinds of photographers, landscape photographers, fashion photographers, street photographers. So if you've not checked it out, you can check out thecandaframe.com and you'll see, you know, a host of different interviews that I hope you'll enjoy. Well, but today I'm going to talk to you about street photography and basically about my journey in terms of how I developed my way of seeing as a result of about being out in the street. So I'll share my screen now. All right. So oftentimes when I write about photography or I talk about photography, I often refer to it as making photographs rather than taking photographs. And for me, taking photographs is a very mechanical thing. It's the action of pressing the button on the camera and it producing a photograph. And there's no real conscious, you know, decision that's being made in terms of composition, about evaluating lighting, your subject in relation to your background. It's just, you know, it's press a button, take a picture. But making photograph is a much more conscious and purposeful choice for me. It's considering a lot of things like light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, and that's what's informed so much of my photography. And I like leading many of my presentations with this quote from Elliot Erwitt. To me, photography is an art of observation. It's about finding something interesting in an ordinary place. I found it has little to do with the things you see and everything to do with the way that you see them. And for me, that is really the joy and the challenge of street photography for me is about seeing things that are everyday, that are mundane in the public world, and somehow finding a relationship between all these elements that are sort of fluidly moving in front of me as I walk down the street and making an interesting image. And you know, this idea the camera doesn't see the world like a human eye does, right? Your eye is a very democratic tool. It sees everything rather equally, and it's your brain is on a particular thing to the exclusion of something else. You know, you can focus your attention on something and be oblivious to everything else. But when it comes to the camera sees everything um, equally and doesn't know how to discern between the object that is drawing your attention or is piquing your curiosity and the other elements that are in the frame. And when you produce a photograph, if you're not conscious of those things, you can produce a picture that falls short of what you aspired to make. You know, you look at a scene like this in a store in downtown Los Angeles where they sell all this bric-a-brac, and there's a bunch of stuff in there. And if you walk into different people walk into the store, some people are going to respond to very different things. Some people may respond to the sculptures or to the map or to the signs with the lights or the chandeliers. You know, this thing is just a hot mess photographically because you have no singular place to really look. And one of the challenges in terms of being a photographer is being able to understand how the camera sees and use that and leverage that so that when you make a photograph, you can start controlling where the viewer will look at and how they'll navigate the frame. You know, and with street scenes, it can be very complex. You have different people that are on the street, there are different moments that are happening, but you have to sort of decide, okay, what do I want to emphasize? Do I want to emphasize the trio on the left, the trio on the right? Do I want to create some sort of interplay between the two? You know, Am I aware of the signage that's there, and how much of a role do I want that to play in the photograph? There are a lot of considerations. There are a lot of choices that you have to make when you go out into the street. And initially, many of us, when we start making photographs, we look at an object and we simply document its existence and just make a basically a photographic, um, a photographic reproduction of the object, like this wheel. We see this wheel and we make the photograph and we've documented what that wheel looks like. And it may have some interesting elements like a repetition of pattern, shape, color, texture that you may or may not be considering when you make those initial photographs. But as you develop as a photographer, you learn to discern from just making a snapshot of something and start thinking, how can you leverage those those aesthetic um, those aesthetics in terms of line, color, light, and use them to your advantage in order to make a photograph. Like for me, I'm in this shot, I'm responding not just to the existence of this classic car, but the relationship between, the newspaper in the blue bag and the shape and the color of the car and the light and the shadow. And I'm considering the things that are happening on the far left and the far right of the frame. I'm thinking about everything in terms of the experience that I'm hoping to provide the viewer when they take a look at the photograph. It's not like I'm just looking at that bag or just looking at the car. I'm seeing everything that's within that 24 to 36 millimeter, frame for a traditional DSLR, even a mirrorless camera, and thinking about, okay, how do all these elements fit into the frame? And when I'm photographing, events like this christening of my niece, I'm thinking just as much about the different elements in the frame. I'm thinking about her and the way her godmother is adjusting her headpiece, but I'm also seeing her father and her godfather, on the far left, the priest, the baptismal in the background. All of these things that are in the frame are things that I have to play with, things that I have to consider. I can't just make a snapshot and just hope that it turns out well. I'm making a conscious choice in terms of what do I include and what I exclude from the frame. And with street photography, it's about that consciousness. It's about having that awareness, even when moments are very fleeting, especially so, because things can happen so rapidly that you don't have the leisure that you might have when you're making a landscape photograph or a still life where things are not moving, where it's just you moving back and forth. But as a street photographer, you're having to think about the fluid elements like the people moving through the scene, as well as the fixed elements like the street, like the building, like the signs, like any sort of element in the distance. But to begin all that, you know i I often just try to get back to sort of a core basic approach to making photographs. I don't go out there on the hunt trying to create all these sort of interesting moments. I hope that they will happen. But I found that just simply being in pursuit of that didn't necessarily result in me being able to make good photographs. I had to sort of break things down for myself so that I could begin to see in the careful way that I'm talking to you about here. Um, so I had to sort of break down in terms of the way that I see. And one of the things that it was important for me to understand, for any photographer to understand, is how the human eye reacts to a scene. And one of the big things is understanding that the eye, especially with a photograph, responds to light and shadow. That contrast between light and dark is a draw. Our eye will immediately go to the brightest element in the frame. And when you know that and you start going out and start making photographs, you don't necessarily have to be on the hunt for an interesting character or for a very dramatic scene. For me, the shooting day starts with me just paying attention to what's happening with the light. And I begin to make images where I'm just exploring light and shadow, the direction of the light, the quality of the light. I find that this helps lead me to interesting scenes that I want to photograph, like this scene where this guy is at a CrossFit gym. It's an overcast day, but when I saw him across the street and I saw what he was doing, I was also taking consideration of what the light was. And that informed the ISO that I was going to use, the fast shutter speed that I wanted to use in order to freeze the action. All of those things that, that inform the camera settings, I, I'm allowed to take care of because I know the kind of light that I'm shooting in and how that affects the shutter speed, the aperture, the white balance. So all of those technical things are taken care of immediately. And it just allows me to just focus on the moment and pay attention to how the light is falling on him and how it recedes into shadow behind him. It's about looking at scenes like this at the Grand Central Market, where these workers are coming through this entryway, and I see how um, the light falls and seeing the contrast between the inside and the outside and realizing this provides a really interesting scene and that all I need is someone to walk through this to give me an interesting shot. It it wasn't that I saw the person there and then I made the shot. No, I saw the potential of the scene solely based on my awareness of light and shadow, and found my frame and simply waited for somebody to come into it. When I'm making a street portrait, the same considerations happen. I'm asking myself, where's the light coming from? What's the quality of the light? Is it hard and harsh? Is it soft and diffused? Because that dictates a lot of what I'm going to do in terms of my technical settings. And then I'm paying attention in terms of how the light falls on the subject and how it falls on the background. All of these are sort of technical choices that I'm processing every time I am about to make a photograph. But those choices, those decisions help me to build a frame that is really effective. I'm making a photograph by putting all these things together. Now, the other thing that the human eye is drawn to is this idea of line and shape. So line and shape have been used just like light and shadow by painters forever. They know how to use light and shadow, line and shape to guide the viewer's eye throughout the frame, where they want people to pay attention first, and how they want people to pay attention to a certain area first, but also how to navigate through the frame. And that for me is like the second consideration I make after I've sort of become aware of what the light and shadow is. It's at that point I go, okay, what's happening with the line and shape? What do I have to play with there? Because just light and shadow in and of itself doesn't produce an interesting photograph, even though street photography, a lot of street photography, especially the kind that you see on Instagram, favors a lot of shadow play. But for me, when I saw the scene, I saw the lines and the shape created by the harsh, high contrast light. I saw the shape of the wheel of the car, the shape of the truck, the tarp, and the shadows created by the figures that were moving, through the scene. It was as much about the line and shape as it was about the quality of the light. And here I was responding to the lines and the shape of this chair, of this table, the stairs in the background, the almost triangular shadow in the middle ground. Right? I saw the light, and then I went, okay, this is very interesting, but how do I start shaping the composition? And line and shape is really what informs how I create that frame, whether I'm going horizontal, whether I'm going vertical, whether I'm including more in the frame or less in the frame. Because line and shape is telling me how the viewer is going to navigate the frame in any given time. And then the photo, and then the line and the shape really, you know, can also provide pattern and a rhythm that can be in and of itself a big draw visually. The pattern of the shadow of the rails um, in the background, the figures, the repetition of the shadow figures in the back, the outline of the figure going up the stairs, the highlight on the rail as it cuts diagonally through the frame. All of those things are line and pattern. right? And yeah, you have light and shadow here, but it's the pattern that I think that really strengthens the image in a way that wouldn't happen if it was just simply, a trio of silhouettes in the frame. Here it's all about line and shape. There's color here, but for me, the heart of this image are the repetitions of line and shapes that happen throughout this frame. There's a synchronicity that's happening here, and the way that you sort of navigate the frame is really informed by the horizontals, the verticals, the implied diagonals. And then, of course, there's definitely color there. But if you strip this image away of the color, the lines really stand out. And you can really see how this whole composition is built largely by me paying attention to the lines, not only at the edges of the frame, but also in the very center, and how they repeat themselves over and over again. And then the last thing I'm paying attention to is color and gesture. And color is is by default the way that we evaluate a scene. We see color and we respond to color like reds and greens and oranges and blues in very different ways. And because so many of our photographs with our digital cameras are made by default in color, it's easy to um, not be as conscious of what color can and does do to your photographs. And you simply look at the object that you're photographing and you just make the picture, whether it's a leaf, whether it's a person, whether it's a car, and just make a picture because it's colorful. But color is just as an important graphic element as the other things that I've been talking to you about in terms of line and shape. And so you have to think about not only the presence of color, but the contrast of color, the oranges and the yellows against the blues, or a limited color palette of just, you know, of blues and reds and greens, even complex images like this, of a cook in one of those food trucks, right? There's a lot of line and shape here, and you see that face and those eyes looking intently towards the lens. But the shot for me is just as much about the color, the strong saturated yellows that are in different places, the blue aqua, the aqua blue that is the center of the frame, the red of his cap. Color here, even though it is not as dominant and not as dominating as the previous shot that I just showed you, is still a big consideration when I'm making the frame. When I'm shooting downtown Los Angeles, you know, I'm always looking for color. Los Angeles, especially the the sort of certain parts of Los Angeles are pretty boring in terms of color. When you start going to downtown, or you go to East LA or some parts of South LA that are largely populated by um, Latino immigrants, you'll see these punchy, saturated colors that come from their culture and from the places they've been through before. But you go to certain parts of other parts of Los Angeles, and everything's muted, dull. You don't deal with those hyper saturated colors. It's very rare. But when I go to downtown Los Angeles, I know that that's present there, and I know that it's another thing that I consider when I'm making photographs. When I see this scene here with this other food truck, I'm looking at all these things that I'm talking to you about: the light and the shadow, the line and the shape, the color, right? And combining all those elements. But this picture has that other thing that I mentioned, which is gesture. It's the gesture of the boy's hand pointing out the drink that he wants his mother to buy. It's the gesture of the profile of his silhouette against the side of the truck. The gesture is her left hand as it dangles in that space between her son's body in that frame, right? And you can see how all of these things are coming together to make for an effective photograph. Nothing in this, and hopefully many of my images, is left to chance. I'm always trying to consider all of those things: light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, when I raise the camera to my eye and I'm making a purposeful choice to make a photograph. This is a photograph of my mother-in-law, and we were spending some time on the front porch, which she loves to do. And I saw the light. I saw the shape and the lines of her hands and the gown she was wearing. The color created by that late afternoon light and the gesture of her like raising her hands in gratitude for the day that was being offered to her. And there's this genuine moment that's happening, which would have been a wonderful shot even if I had not paid careful attention to everything else. But it becomes that much more of an interesting photograph because I was paying attention to all those visual elements. There are not elements in this shot that I find distracting or take away from the moment. And one of the things that I'm always considering, and I tell people that I'm teaching, is I'm always asking myself, why am I making this photograph? Why am I making the choice to raise the camera at this particular moment with this particular subject matter and to make an image? And it's something that I need to understand so that I'm not shooting blindly, that I'm not strictly just shooting on blind impulse and not taking careful consideration of what I'm using to make the shot. I'm asking myself this question: what needs to be and what doesn't need to be in the photograph? Because as the photographer, I'm completely responsible for what happens in that frame. And if anything finds its way in that photograph, I should be aware of it. And if I'm not aware of it, why not? Because I have found, and you've probably had this experience as well. You make a photograph, you think it's the greatest photograph you've ever taken, and you pull it up in your computer, and you see all these distracting elements in the background, things that completely diminish the power of the photograph, things that you felt like I didn't even see that until it comes on the computer screen. And I think everybody goes through that. It's just one of the parts of learning how to become a better photographer is learning to be aware of that stuff while you're making the photographs and not have it constantly be that you discover it once it's too late. Um, when I was teaching, I teach a photo workshop through Los Angeles Center of Photography, and I sometimes took them to this farmers market in Hollywood. And one of the challenges I posed to them is try to make a photograph that is not typical of the kind of picture that people normally make when they go to a farmer's market. Because when you go to a farmer's market, you take pictures of people walking up and down the street. You take pictures of the vegetables and the fruit. They're on the stands. People eating whatever food they are, and it's they're photographs that are largely uninspired because basically you're just making snapshots. You're just basically documenting what's happening there. But I challenge myself and my students to say, okay, just forget the fact that you're at a farmer's market. Don't think about the typical shots that you make and try to repeat yourself and try to make it better. I said, take a step back, take a look at the ideas that I'm sharing with you in terms of looking for light and shadow, line and shape, color. Try to basically see the world in a very abstract way. And then it can lead to a bunch of different choices that you never would have considered otherwise. And that was the case here. I could see how this light, you know, was illuminating the scene, and I love the contrast. So I exposed it so that the shadows would go completely black, and I could see that people were walking in and out. So I built this composition, and I just waited until someone actually left, started walking out, and was illuminated by that light. So I built the composition, I built the frame, and then it was just a matter of waiting for that, for that telling element to sort of come into the scene. Same thing when I was in South Africa. I saw this light and shadow play. I saw the line and the shape, saw the color, found and composed my frame, and I just waited. And as different people moved through the scene, I made photographs until this girl who was just perfectly cast walked into the frame. And the color of her pants and the A on her black shirt perfectly mirror the colors of the mural behind her. I could not have anticipated that when I stopped at this scene and I composed the frame, but I got it. And I love the gesture of the way her hands, the way her legs are splayed, the way her hands extend away from her body, and her tongue is sticking out from between her lips. And the way that she is positioned in between the shadow on the left hand side and the that space between the chin and the shoulder of the mural character was a conscious choice. I could see her coming, and I'd already figured out exactly where I wanted any subject that came into the frame. So, figuring out all these other considerations in terms of exposure, in terms of where to focus, allowed me to just completely narrow my attention to the figure and where I wanted them in the frame. And by being conscious of all these things, it frees me to really focus on the moment, on really getting something that's interesting. And this idea of paying attention to light and shadow and line and shape and color and gesture is with me always. This is an image I made in my kitchen. I'm having coffee and I just see the light coming through the window in my kitchen, and I immediately respond to it. I don't necessarily have to be out in the street. I don't have to be in Paris or in Vancouver in order to be observing what's happening with light and line and shape and all those things that I mentioned to you. It can happen anywhere and any time for me, and it's something that I'm constantly practicing. I made this photograph in bathroom, and it was just like the toilet paper, the towels on the wall, and it was like I saw it for the first time. And these images are images that I made over the past year where we were, during COVID, during the pandemic. And because I wasn't going out and making photographs in the street the way that I normally did, I was trying to challenge myself about trying to find interesting scenes in my immediate environment, even though I wasn't surrounded by people making images like this image here. I love this kind of stuff. I love going out there with this sense of unpredictability of that anything can happen, you know, but it's something that I practice all the time. Here I saw this green door and I knew that I wanted to make a photograph there. I knew that the light was good. And I just looked around and I found this guy with these tattoos on his hands, and I moved him into the scene. And it was like, I couldn't have found a more perfect subject because the salmon colored sweat top that he was was wearing perfectly contrasted the green, which mirrored the green of his tattoos. And all I had to do was just choose the appropriate aperture to get enough depth of field to give me the shot that I wanted. Or when I'm in San Francisco, I saw this scene, with the shoes of the mannequin on the right, the coffee coffee truck on the left, the light and the shadows, and I found my frame, and it was just I just made photographs of different people walking through the scene until I was gifted with this woman with this wonderful purplish, you know, coat that mirrored the color of the shoes a little bit. And it was like, okay, I built my shot. I've had that moment sort of pay off. When I was in New York, looking at this light that was being reflected off of a skyscraper behind me, and throwing this shaft of light into the middle of the street right in front of the New York Public Library. And just standing there as people walked out of the shadows into the light, just making photographs, knowing full well that the person walking into the light would stand in strong relief to everything else that was in shadow. It was because I was paying attention to that I made choices that allowed me to make photographs. I see these lines of this corner in this intersection, and I'm seeing people coming from the left and from the right. And just because of the flow of traffic, I know that there's going to be moments where people come together as they come to that point, and here these two guys almost bump into each other and have a moment of tension that I didn't really anticipate. I just saw them coming from different directions, and just by their pace and their gait, I knew they come into contact. And so when this moment happened, I just made the one frame. And it was a really it was a photograph I couldn't have made if I saw the conflict and raised the camera to my eye, because it was so fleeting. It would have been too late. I just saw them coming in. I had this anticipation, which is one of the things that I love about reading the street that really pays off. So by paying attention to all these things that I'm talking to you about, I can have a scene that's playing off, that's, you know, that's happening within moments, or I can use those very same techniques when I'm making a portrait. All those considerations, light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, I'm thinking about, I'm processing, I'm evaluating, and then making the choices about what do I include in the frame, what do I exclude from the frame. I've been working on before COVID, I was working on a series where I photograph the morning routines of families. So I usually go to their house soon after they've woken up, and just become a fly on the wall, photographing different moments. And for me, this is the same as photographing on the street, taking a look at my subjects, thinking about what's happening in front of the subject, what's happening behind, what's the light like, what's the line like, you know, looking for different gestures. I love the way, you know, the girl here leans against her father while he's preparing her breakfast, and the gesture of her hand up to her face. You know, it's the my processing of the scene as I'm moving myself into position and I raise the camera to my eye, and the choices that I'm making up up until the moment I press the button allows me to pay attention to those small details and not just put it on motor drive and just fire blindly hoping that I get something interesting. I want to see it, or I want to see it about to happen, and making that conscious choice in order to make the photograph. And when things are moving fast, I'm still making those considerations. And I find that my work on the street has really allowed me to hone those skills, that even when I'm photographing a young girl with endless energy and I see this scene playing out while she's um, playing with her. Hold on a second. I thought I'd shut that off. Do you guys see that backblaze thing? Okay, hopefully you don't see it. Um, so it frees me to see, like this in New York. I saw that transition between light and shadow, and I just stopped, and I just knew that something interesting would come out as a result. And I was gifted with this woman who, just as she walked out of the shadows, this gust of wind came up and hit her in the face, and she raised her hand to her face. Right? Or the scene in Japan, you know, where I saw this street scene even before people were there, and looked at it and go, "Oh, this might be an interesting, you know, place setting for a photograph." And then within minutes, all these people converged onto the space. And because I'd already seen it, because I'd already imagined the possibility or the potential of the scene for a composition, when everything came together, it was like I had I was a puppet master controlling exactly where everyone was in the frame. And I think that consciousness of what's happening as I'm looking at a scene and the choices I'm making help me to really refine my vision, so that when that special moment reveals itself, you know, it happens like here with the drummer. And I was waiting for that moment where he turned his face to the left, you know, because I was his back was to me, and I knew I wanted that. And I got this wonderful intensity to his expression with the way he sort of has his lips tightened up as he's playing the drums. Um, if I was just firing, just taking pictures as he was playing, you know, I would have had a lot of pictures with just his back to the frame. And I knew that I didn't want that. I knew what I wanted just from seeing the scene. So I've written several books. This is the most recent one that I've done. It's called Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. You can order it through Rocky Nook, or it's also available on Amazon. And there I talk about a lot of the process that I'm sharing with you today, the way I break down, seeing light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, but it goes through it in a more thorough way. I've also done a series of ebooks that sort of give you primers. Um, the 9 pictures, are just that. I include 9 photographs in these ebooks where I talk about my process of discovering the scene, making the series of choices, and making the photographs. The Candid Frame on street photography is just a primer just on that, on street photography, and Lessons on the Street was the follow up to that. And as I mentioned, thecandaframe.com is my podcast where I interview photographers about their work and their careers and the kind of things um, that that allow them to lead a photographic life. And it's not so much about, well, what lens do you use, or what do you use, Lightroom or do you use Capture One? It's not so much a technical discussion of photography, but more about process, about creativity, um, about how one sort of defines a photographic life for themselves, whether or not they're professionals or not. And you can go to thecandidframe.com, where you'll find a lot of my photographs. I can also be followed on Instagram, where I'm much more current with the work that I produce. So I'll just stop my screen share here.